Lindsay Stern, attorney and policy advisor here. Thank you all so much for being here live and for those who are here virtually. For a lot of reasons, I'm very pleased that all my panelists are here in person today. So thank you to all of you as well. Before we start, I just wanted to give a brief background on USF, USF reform, and then introduce our panelists. And then we'll be hearing a brief presentation from Carol Mattey, one of our panelists, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Okay. Yeah, thank you again for all being here. So this panel, USF reform, process proposals and prospects of moving forward. So the FCC's Universal Service Fund, or more commonly known as USF, has been one of the nation's most important tools for connecting families, small businesses, and communities, both rural and urban, to voice and broadband services. The USF is comprised of 4 FCC programs to help fund and implement the principle that all people in the US should have access to affordable communications services as mandated by Congress in the Telecom Act of 1996. For those not familiar, these 4 USF programs are high-cost support, which includes programs to support service in rural areas, Lifeline for low-income consumers, E-rate for schools and libraries, and rural healthcare for rural healthcare providers. These 4 programs are often referred to as the distribution side of USF because they distribute the funding. But today's panel discussion will focus on the contribution side, which is how these programs are funded. The current USF funding mechanism is under significant duress. In the last 2 decades, the revenues subject to USF assessment have declined by 63%, and the contribution factor has increased from less than 7% in 2001 to a historic high of over 30%. And given these trends, the contribution factor could approach 40% or more in the coming years. Reforming the current USF funding system is long overdue. For over 2 years, INCOMPAS has been working closely with various stakeholders to assess the best path forward. Last year, 3 organizations, INCOMPAS, NTCA, and Shelby, released the USForward report by USF expert and former senior FCC official Carol Mattey, who joins us today. And the report confirms why we need USF reform. It evaluates the FCC's options, and it recommends that expanding the contribution base to include broadband internet access revenues is the best path forward. Last November, over 254 organizations signed on to a call to action letter, which calls on the FCC to move forward with the USF reform and to adopt the USForward's proposal in order to ensure the enduring value of universal service and America's connectivity rules. Last year, we also saw Congress introduce a bipartisan, bicameral bill, the Reforming Broadband Connectivity Act, which would require the FCC to complete a USF reform rulemaking within 1 year. So there's clearly a strong desire by various stakeholders for the FCC to move forward with the USF reform. And I'm honored to be moderating this panel today with such esteemed panelists who each bring a unique perspective on this topic. Welcome to our panelists. Just to quickly introduce them, Carol Mattey is the principal of Mattey Consulting, LLC. She's one of the nation's leading experts on universal service, drawing on more than a decade of experience as deputy chief of the FCC's Wireline Competition Bureau, overseeing the FCC's universal service programs. At the FCC, she led efforts to modernize the FCC's universal service programs. She currently advises broadband providers and others active in the telecom industry with a particular focus on RDOF and other government broadband funding programs. Nell Geiser is Director of Research for the Communication Workers of America, a labor union representing workers in telecom, media, tech, and other sectors. CWA has long advocated for universal service principles and robust public oversight of communications networks. Nell supports CWA's telecom policy program at the state and federal level and is a chartered financial analyst. Andrew Brown is the managing partner of Levine, Blaszak, and Boothby, aka LB3, and chairman of the firm's consulting affiliate, Tech Caliber Consulting. He represents large enterprise and public sector customers in strategic sourcing and contract negotiations for ICT products and services. He also provides regulatory advice and advocacy on issues critical to the end user community, including universal service, net neutrality, and other proceedings that affect the cost and competitiveness of enterprise ICT product services. He serves as co-counsel to the Ad Hoc Telecom Users Committee, an organization of large enterprise customers of ICT, which has been a long-standing participant in regulatory proceedings that promote competition and user choice and overall efficiency in the marketplace. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us today. So before we get into Q&A with the panelists, I want to welcome Carol Mattey to give a brief presentation on her findings in the USForward report.
Thanks so much. Good to be here. I appreciate it. So I'm just going to very quickly summarize what was in the USF report that was USForward report that was released in September. I'm going to start off by talking about who currently contributes to USF, and this may be very familiar to some of you, but just by way of background, the Universal Service Fund contribution system that's been in place for decades relies upon contributions from providers of telecommunications services, and the assessment is based on their interstate and international revenues, as well as some revenues from additional services such as private line. The slide shows on the left all of the particular services that contribute. The blue area is showing what does not contribute to USF today, and that includes broadband internet access services, as well as wholesale revenues, and some other services. I think it's important to realize that while there are more than 2,000 contributors today to USF, 80% of the contributions base comes from 10 companies. And these are the largest service providers in the country. Not surprisingly, it includes AT&T, Verizon, Lumen, Comcast, and Charter. The revenues come from VoIP, and as well as mobile services, and as I said, business data services. But this is an important thing to remember. While these service providers make the contributions into the Universal Service Fund, most of them typically pass it along to their customers, both business users as well as residential households, in the form of a line item. So it's actually not directly impacting their bottom line. It's consumers and businesses that actually contribute. So let's go to the next slide and talk about how the fund, the contribution base has been declining. The report uses figures both from the FCC's monitoring report, as well as the figures from USAC, which is the fund administrator and is required to report revenues on a quarterly basis to the FCC. As you can see on this chart from the report, the contribution base had fallen from 67 billion in 2010 to roughly 43 billion in 2019. That's the area shown in green on the chart, while the blue area shows the non-telecommunications revenues, which are not subject to assessment, but are nonetheless reported to the US, to USAC and to the FCC. Those blue revenues are not subject to assessment. And as you can see, not surprisingly, the communications revenues overall have been growing over that same time period. Now, to put this chart in perspective, the more recent figures from USAC show that the contribution base had declined to barely over 29 billion in 2021. So the next slide, we'll talk about why are these assessable revenues declining. People often assume it is because of the decline in toll revenues or the fact that so many people have dropped their landline telephone service. Now, while both of these trends have contributed to the decline, in fact, what I found in looking at the issue is the most dramatic decline over the last 2 decades has been on the mobile revenue side. According to the most recent monitoring report from the FCC, mobile revenues, which specifically we're talking about mobile voice, declined 69% between 2011 and 2020. In contrast, local service revenues, which includes both traditional landline phones as well as VoIP providers, declined 33% over the same period, and toll revenues declined 44%. Now, at first, this may seem counterintuitive. People may say, but the mobile sector has been growing steadily. But the explanation is very simple. It's the fact that mobile providers are reporting only the revenues allocated to voice service. And because they sell a bundled voice and data service product, they are only allocating about 20% of that monthly revenue to the voice side. And I will say, under the FCC's rules, they have the discretion to do this. The FCC has several safe harbors, but it also allows service providers that offer bundled product to use any reasonable method for allocating their revenues between accessible and non-accessible services. And when you think about how you use your mobile phone today, most of you use it for data, and very few of you are probably using it extensively for having voice calls on the telephone. So next slide. The report projects what will happen over the coming 5 years. Over the last 5 years, the average annualized rate of decline in the accessible revenues was 5 to 6%, and there's no reason to believe that that trend is going to reverse. Indeed, according to the most recent figures available from USAC, the trend over the last 4 quarters shows a more than 10% decline compared to the prior 4 quarters. But in any event, in the report, I use that conservative 5% assumed revenue decline to project forward what will happen to the contribution factor over time. Next slide, please. The report projects how the contribution factor will rise over the coming 5 years. And it uses that assumption that there'd be a continued 5% decline in reported accessible revenues, and it uses the FCC's own assumptions about what the size of the Universal Service Fund will be. The FCC is required by law to report what's called the 10-year forecast of the Universal Service Fund to the Office of Management and Budget, and I use the FCC's own projections as to the size of the USF. So the chart shows that over time, the contribution factor could rise to be over 40% by 2025. And as Lindsay pointed out, this is a dramatic change, with the fund contribution factor, being in the 6-7%, then growing to the 20%, and then, in the last year to be over 30%. Now, I'll pause and just say for a moment why the contribution factor has dropped in the last 2 quarters. Some of you may, be saying, but look, that chart's not right. In fact, it's under 30%. It's in the 20s these days. And the reason for that is not because revenues have stopped declining, but rather there has been what I would view as a somewhat temporary blip in terms of the reported demand due to the implementation of some of those high cost programs and other things that are going on. So what's really going on is the demand side has actually dropped, but the revenues are continuing to decline. And that itself is a problem. That's a problem because it shows that the factor is fluctuating dramatically up and down from quarter to quarter for various reasons. And that's hard for businesses and households in terms of changing pass-through charges to deal with. And at the end of the day, I believe that there still is a definite need to move forward as quickly as possible. So the next slide will show, as I said, the report looks at the 3 options for reform that the FCC has sought comment on multiple times over the years: assessing broadband internet access service revenues, assessing a flat fee per connection, both voice and broadband, and alternatively, a flat fee per phone number. Obviously, Commissioner Nelson described, these options as part of his presentation before this panel. I think it's important to understand some of the issues with each of the options and as an explanation of why I ultimately came out in favor of assessing broadband revenues. One of the issues with assessing connections, obviously, it's relatively easy to determine what a connection is on the residential side, but it's much more difficult to determine how to assess broadband connections that are provided to businesses and large enterprise users because of how do you classify them and do you group them into tiers based on capacity and so forth. One of the issues with assessing numbers is the fact that services that for whatever reason don't have a working telephone number would escape assessment altogether. And at the end of the day, the report recommends that the FCC move forward to assess broadband internet access revenues. And if the FCC were to do that, as shown on the next slide, the contribution factor, you should advance to the next slide, sorry. The contribution factor would drop to less than 4%, which would be a dramatic change from what exists today. Now, at this point, I'm going to stop a moment because some of you may be familiar with a study that was released last year by Hal Singer that examined what would happen if you assess broadband internet revenues, and alternatively, what would happen if one were to assess digital advertising revenues. And the figures that are in the Singer paper are significantly different than mine, and I want to explain why. Singer, when he modeled out what the assessment would be if you were to assess broadband, only included landline broadband revenues. He did not include fixed wireless broadband revenues, and he did not notably include mobile broadband revenues. His justification for that is that the services, in his view, were complementary, not substitutes. But in any event, because of that, he was assuming a much lower amount of broadband revenues than I assumed in my study. And secondly, Singer, in terms of analyzing what the contribution factor would be, assumed that the overall demand for the Universal Service Fund would be $17 billion, which is basically close to twice the amount it is today. And the reason that he came up with that figure is he assumed that the FCC would create a permanent replacement lifeline mechanism that would provide a $50 subsidy to all low-income households, and notably that 75% of all eligible households would subscribe to that subsidy program. And I'll note, Lifeline today has subscriptions, basically like 20% of those eligible actually take the benefit. And the same has been true thus far for the Affordable Connectivity Program. So those are the reasons why he came up with such different numbers than I did. So I'm going to wrap it up with my last slide so we can get to the discussion. The last slide summarizes the reasons why the report recommends that the FCC should move to assess broadband internet revenues. The first is that it's common sense, basic public policy, that if the fund is in fact supporting broadband in all 4 of the distribution programs, broadband revenues should contribute to support the program. And to the extent that people are concerned that assessing broadband revenues would have a regressive effect on low-income households, there are other ways to deal with that, such as prohibiting service providers from having a pass-through charge to households that are in fact qualifying for those low-income subsidy programs. The second reason is that broadband revenues are stable. We should assume they would be stable, and that would stabilize the contribution factor. The third is that this could be done quickly, as Commissioner Nelson noted. It does not require legislative change. We do not have to wait for Congress to act. The fourth reason is it would be transparent. As I said earlier, 80% of the contribution base today comes from just 10 publicly traded companies. They're reporting their revenues, their broadband revenues, to Wall Street, and that provides an additional safety mechanism for USAC to check to make sure that revenues are in fact being accurately reported for contributions purposes. And this is one of the notable reasons why, at the end of the day, I came to the conclusion that a system based on either connections or numbers would have critical flaws, because it would be very difficult to audit and enforce, because those would be self-reported figures. I was going to say numbers, and there would be no external force that would provide an assurance that they would actually be accurate. And last but not least, the report concludes that this would be more equitable, and it would spread the contribution burden more fairly across all that benefit from the fund. Unfortunately, what has happened today is that older Americans, those that still have a landline phone, are frankly disproportionately carrying the burden of the Universal Service Fund, and the younger generation and those that have dropped the landline phone are not paying as much. So with that, I will stop and go back to the panel discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Carol. Sorry, I'm all the way over here now, but thanks for that great presentation. And now I just wanted to turn it over and ask some questions to the whole panel. So something that I think is really great and important about this panel and the makeup of it is that you're all coming to this topic of USF reform with really different perspectives, yet you all signed on to the call of action letter that I referenced that went out last November. So could you each talk a bit about why USF and specifically USF reform is important to you and your organization? And we can start with Nell, then Andrew and Carol.
Great. Thank you for having CWA here at the panel. It's a really important topic for us. And the Communications Workers of America was formed by telephone operators and technicians who were willing to go on strike to hold their monopolist employer to account. And from earning poverty wages in the 1920s, these workers built a national union, and by mid-century won major wage increases, and eventually in the 70s, achieved the ability to bargain with the Bell system at the national level, ensuring consistent sectoral standards. These hundreds of thousands of workers together exerted real countervailing power against their employer to ensure they could live decent lives and benefit from economic growth and productivity growth. Telecom workers are also consumers, and they understand that—
Oh, Nell, is your mic on?
It is on. I'm also trying to talk loud. Oh, is that better? Maybe it wasn't on. Green.
Same thing happened to me.
Green, but no sound.
Can we keep going if she just talks loudly for now? All right, you want to come up to the podium for now? No. No. Just for now, we'll just go up to the podium. Okay. Hopefully we'll. Sorry about that. You just pick up where you left off.
Yeah, so as I was saying, CWA, formed by telephone operators and technicians, were able to really change their material conditions over the course of the 20th century and achieve national bargaining in the 1970s with the Bell system. And throughout this period, they are these hundreds of thousands of workers who built and operated the telephone system in the US were also members of their communities who understood the struggles and needs of their neighbors, and CWA members therefore built a culture where they take collective action not only on the immediate issues of their economic interests, wages, job security, and working conditions, but also on the principles of universal service. CWA has long partnered with consumer allies to fight for accountability from communications providers who calibrate their capital investments to maximize profit and often engage in regulatory arbitrage. Universal service is in our DNA, and the Universal Service Fund has been an essential, if imperfect, tool toward closing the digital divide in recent years. From the impressive gains of E-rate for school connectivity to meaningful deployment progress through CAF auctions to modernizing the Lifeline program to include broadband. But the sad state of the Universal Service Fund is one among many negative consequences of regulatory arbitrage by communications providers and failure of our political system to work in the interests of the 99%. It also reflects the lowest common denominator form of competition that we have today, which plays out in an entrenched digital divide, leaving rural communities and low-income people with inferior options for connectivity. So reforming the contribution mechanism encapsulates many of the core questions at play and charting a new era in regulation of communications networks that maximizes public welfare and ensures fair competition. So that's why CWA signed on to the letter. We agree, we believe that there is consensus to move forward as Carol described, though we think the boundaries should be pushed to ensure that everyone who contributes and benefits from broadband is contributing to the USF, and we can get more into the details, but I'll turn it to Andrew.
Come on down.
Yeah, it is. I'm not gonna put my hands up and say that I'm gonna Hi. Okay, this amplifies.
Thank you for having me. First of all, Lindsay, it's great to be here at INCOMPAS. I represent large business users of telecommunications, and in particular, a smaller group of large business users called the Ad Hoc Telecom Users Committee. And we have, over many issues over the years, partnered with INCOMPAS because we both share a very committed philosophy to a pro-competition agenda because of the fact that competition is the way to get access, to get affordability, and to just improve what was historically and still in many ways is a monopolist-driven environment. With respect to USF, to answer your questions, why do we care about USF? Well, businesses actually do care a lot about USF because in particular, universal services is a critical business goal because that is how their customers communicate with them. That is how they sell products and services. That is how they have distributed workforces. I'm going to get feedback, aren't I? Is my mic on? So it's really important for a universal service to exist. Now, the means to do that is obviously the $50 million question that we've been working on for 30 years, but it is a big commitment for businesses to have a connected population. Universal Service Fund reform is a big issue for the reason that Carol mentioned and Commissioner Nelson mentioned, which is businesses and residential consumers pay for universal service funding. That often gets lost in the translation, so I appreciate Carol making that point very clearly. This is a burden assumed by the people that buy the services that are being subsidized and that are being distributed throughout the country for universal service. So Ad Hoc has always been very committed to having an efficient and effective universal service fund and to have a contribution factor or whatever system we have to contribute and fund universal service that follows the statutory mandate of being predictable and fair and non-discriminatory and equitable, which the current system just isn't in any respect. The biggest problem that universal service faces right now under the current system of contributions is that it is eventually going to collapse. It just can't get much higher when you are assessing a base that is shrinking so quickly. And we are really at a tipping point. We've been saying that for some time now, and you always think, well, you know, you're crying wolf at a certain point. But what's going to happen in the next probably 12 to 24 months is something that Carol alluded to, which is we've seen a reduction in demand, a reduction in the contribution factor, and there's going to be a huge spike when demand catches up. And that is really going to cause some serious problems for consumers and businesses. So I will leave that in answer to your first question. I know we have other things to talk about. So.
Carol, is your mic working? Come on down, Carol.
Just gonna get my exercise. I'll keep it very brief. Why I think this is important, obviously I worked on it for 2 decades. It's a personal passion of mine. One of my biggest regrets is the fact that I could not get the contributions reform proceeding over the finish line while I was at the FCC. So I've continued to work on this issue, hoping that I can get it done this time. So.
Great. So the FCC has had USF reform pending at the Commission for over 2 decades, and it has the ability and the authority to move forward with the proposal laid out in the USForward report. Yet in the past 2 years, we've seen a real momentum for a call for reform, as Andrew was talking about. So why do you think reform is finally ripe to move forward today? And how quickly do we need to act to save the program? Andrew, I know you alluded to this before, but does anyone want to take that?
I can start. Should we still come up?
What do you think? Yeah, and I'm getting the nod from Angie.
We can.
Yeah.
Sure. Let's be innovative.
Yeah. Okay.
We can like stand kind of our. Yeah, that's a good idea. It's like a game show.
I think we're all going to have some of the same things to say on this point because it's clear that today that the needed reforms, are critical, that they're more likely than ever before. Chair Rosenworcel has signaled, seriousness and willingness to lead on this, but we do need a fully staffed FCC, so we need the Senate to confirm Gigi Sohn. We have, an FCC leadership that cares, but what we faced in the past is, as Carol's talking about, just changes of leadership before anything can get done. And it's been very sad to watch, but expansion to VoIP was meant to offset some pressure in 2006, but that wasn't enough given the growing dominance of broadband as our means to connect to the world, as Carol explained so clearly. And payers like Andrew's clients also want to see change spurred by their continued reliance on services that are covered by USF charges puts them at a disadvantage to other information services that often are used by the same large enterprises, but are not subject to the surcharge. So, I think we should really talk seriously about something that the National Law Review published a summation last year that described an approach that focuses on transmission capabilities, whether an information service or a telecommunication service. This would be more inclusive and technology neutral. So thinking about transmission service, that could include a wide range of things that are not covered now, especially in the enterprise space.
Yeah, I mean, because, the question you asked was, well, why is it right now? Because Carol has been working on this for 20 years. I think I've been coming to, when she was at the FCC, showing up and asking her to do something for me. I think it's right now, honestly, because the factor got to a point that was very high, but I think really it was the pandemic that has revealed so much in all of our policy decision-making right now. And so what it has revealed about USF is whatever USF has been accomplishing, it hasn't been adequate to provide universal service, as is evidenced by a lot of the legislation that has recently come out. And so the change to USF, I think, is very critical for that reason. And it's also the fact that the base really is getting to a point where you just have to have your head in the sand if you think that you are going to be able to continue to fund universal service, even at an $8.5 billion level on this base. It's just too low. You've got to find something else to assess. And as Nell mentioned, they tried with VoIP, but that wasn't going to be sufficient revenue for the long term. The only thing that you're really going to be able to do in the medium term is to assess broadband, which is, I think, a big part of Carol's conclusions, but I won't speak for her on that.
I agree everything that's been said, and I think that it's important to realize that there are now a broad cross-section of interested stakeholders that have come out publicly stating that this needs to be done. As those of you that are familiar with FCC proceedings, for so many years, this proceeding was sort of on the back burner. And people weren't focusing on it. And it really helps when you have a broad cross-section of parties that otherwise may have completely divergent interests and disagree on other issues. When people join together and say something needs to be done, that also creates momentum.
This format. So, Andrew, I have a question for you. Kind of going off of what you were talking about before, but we at INCOMPAS, we've been hearing for years now from some of our members that the increasing contribution factor has been really difficult to manage with their customers. And you are counsel to the Ad Hoc Telecom Users Committee, so you can appreciate this customer perspective that we've been hearing from our members. So can you explain to us a bit more from your client's perspective why the increasing contribution factor is not only frustrating for them, but it's also impacting and how it's impacting their business?
I live for this question that nobody asks me at a cocktail party or a school event. My kids are not interested in this. Yes, this is the question I gave there. So as I think all of you can understand, the factor at a 20, 25, 30% number is really quite market distorting in terms of the choices that businesses make for the kinds of services that they're going to purchase. Because the way the factor is applied now, particularly with respect to internet access, is not equitable. It's not right. It is assessed on business internet access, and for the identical service for bias or broadband internet access service to consumers, it's not assessed. And so the first question that I frequently get is, how do I get out of the assessment? How do I engage in regulatory arbitrage to get out of paying this? And it's nothing unseemly about it. It's how do I find a functionally equivalent service that is 33% cheaper or 27% cheaper? So that has a profound impact on businesses right now, what in kind of the decisions they're making. And technology has caught up to this decision, frankly, with SD-WAN services and a lot of opportunities to push very small connections to really accomplish very big things on enterprise networks, businesses really can start to utilize what are essentially consumer-based services. We also have a really interesting phenomenon going on right now, which I mentioned as a result of the pandemic. And Nell and I were kind of talking about this a little bit earlier, which is people are working from home now. They are doing business activities from home, right? So your broadband connection to your house isn't really a broadband connection for your house anymore, right? A lot of people are doing business on that connection. So you have a model where businesses are starting to contemplate subsidizing for their employees or paying for their home broadband connection, which is not assessed. The lines between business and residential services has gotten blurred tremendously. It got blurred 10 years ago with mobile services because people use their same phone for work and for business. Sometimes it's subsidized by a company, sometimes it's not. So this distinction is becoming increasingly untenable. And what businesses are finding is that they are making those decisions for all the wrong reasons, right? When you have a regulatory regime that makes those decisions based upon the assessment factor, you know you've got a problem. So that's I think the biggest issue that businesses are trying to deal with right now, and why we continue to be so motivated by reform. And I want to say one last thing while I've got the mic, which is I do want to thank INCOMPAS for being a part of what was not an easy process of getting a lot of different people together to come up with a solution. Because as you guys just pointed out, it's not often that I'm on a panel with Nell and agreeing, right? It's just not typically the thing, which is not to say anything negative about her advocacy. It's that it's an unusual situation because you have a very diverse group of stakeholders. There are a couple of stakeholders that didn't show up, but you can guess who they are. And I think that says a lot about kind of the viability of the solution that we're trying to promote. So.
Carol,
I had a small follow-up. The report analyzed the trends in the contribution factor and found over the last 5 years, it averaged about 5% per year. In preparation for this panel, I checked the figures last night, and it's been 10% in the last 4 quarters. Is that a coincidence, or is that a fact that as the contribution factor skyrocketed over 30%, people and businesses were finding ways to get a different product and not pay?
So Nell, question for you. One of the main points of the USForward report and in favor of expanding the contribution base to include broadband internet access service is that the current system is not equitable. So all 4 USF programs fund broadband programs, yet these same services are not currently paying into USF. So what is CWA's perspective on why the recommendation of including broadband revenues makes for a more equitable system?
Thank you. So we, again, completely agree with Carol's assessment that inclusion of bias is an important step forward. It is common sense when you think about how the USF was designed to achieve universal service and how it's being used today to support broadband access. As Commissioner Nelson said, it is common sense. And we believe that the FCC also is empowered to act on this, and the reason that they would is to achieve their mandate, which is to provide universal service at affordable rates, and I think that's how we're going to achieve a better system. But the devil is very much in the details, as we've been talking about, with exactly what revenues to assess. And so in terms of talking about equity, we've already covered how older people are harmed, how businesses have to engage in arbitrage. And I think, one of the elephants in the rooms is big tech, and is this question of, well, the FCC can act on, bias revenues, but probably not on digital ads, because that would be outside of 254, the part of the statute that governs this mechanism, right? So what is a better way to think about the broadband ecosystem? As I mentioned, the National Law Review piece on this makes a really helpful point that has to be teased out by looking at the material facts of what services are businesses and residents paying for to achieve connectivity, whether that be cloud services, whether that be SD1, you know, all of these things are achieving the same goals. And so I just want to really emphasize that point that there's not an obvious boundary around what bias should constitute, and it might be bigger than we think it could be. And that if you can keep the contribution factor below 5% or below 4%, maybe it doesn't get passed through. And there's economists who would say that. So the goal here should be to not pass this through, to make it as progressive as possible a policy, and to look very seriously through an FCC proceeding at exactly the definitions here. We all, I think, hope that will happen as expeditiously as possible.
Thank you. All right, so it's past 2:15 and I was really hoping to sneak in a few more questions because there's a lot I want to ask you guys, but I've been cued that I need to end. So apologies that I couldn't get to the rest of the questions, but thank you so much. Let's give it up for our panelists. Thank you so much.